I'm Matt Wilhelmy. I'm the owner of Strategic Voyages Business Consultants. I'm also the author of Taboo Business Questions, What's Haunting Every Entrepreneur's Growth. And today I'm really excited because I'm joined by Kathy Guillory. She is a fractional chief marketing officer with Belle Bear Marketing, specializing in multi-location marketing. Kathy works with consumer-facing businesses with 3 or more locations across animal health, pet services, retail banking, automotive, aesthetics practices, and many others. Kathy, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Matt.
You know, as we were kind of preparing for this episode, one of the things that I really appreciated was your specialty and really kind of delineating that from a lot of other fractional marketers. You know, and I think that some of our guests are going to hear, or our audience is going to hear, you know, a fractional CMO, they're all kind of in the same bucket, but you're different because you have this specialty for multi-location marketing. Can you tell me about maybe a project or two that really kind of helped you see the value in having kind of differentiation and being able to handle multiple locations and marketing for them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I sort of landed on this through just the breadth of my experience over the years. I've been a marketer for about 18 years, and most of my career has been built across these multi-location businesses. One of my early jobs was working for Simon Malls. They're an international, very large retail mall, essentially. And I was the liaison between corporate marketing and 60 plus of their local locations on site. So it was kind of my first dabble in this. Then I also led a local marketing team for a consumer bank here in Maine, where we had multiple locations over a very geographically dispersed state. So some of them were over 100 miles from each other. So really differentiating that brand presence and establishing a foothold in each market. And then, you know, most recently, before I left the corporate world, I worked for a consolidator in the animal health space. And so there, my team managed digital marketing for 150 unique pet care and veterinary brands across the entire US. And so it was a very acquisition heavy process. As you can imagine, we onboarded over 50 new brands in the year and a half I was there. So very familiar with really scaling very quickly and building those processes to make sure that everyone is, you know, being integrated thoroughly and that marketing is working at every location, not just the 1 or 2 that are the flagships.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I would imagine when you're working with these companies and they've got locations, even in the same state, there's still different demographics, you know, income levels or distance that they have to drive to some of these consumer facing locations. And you're able to kind of develop a strategy to address all of that. And I'm wondering if, you know, in your experience, you've come across any trends in terms of maybe the symptoms that some of these clients face. You know, what are some of the things that you see as being like the commonalities among some of these folks?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of them. There are a few that really jump out. So at the root of it, right, multi-location marketing is different. I think the biggest challenge for everybody is to find that balance between your centralized control, right? What does corporate marketing own? And then what do the local teams do on their own? You know, a couple of the big symptoms, inconsistent branding is very, very common. So that's usually the result of a few bigger challenges. Sometimes it starts with there are no clear branding guidelines, right? They're not developed or they're not shared with the field, or the support for the local teams is lacking. Or, you know, in terms of the teams have to create their own marketing materials with very, very few guardrails. That's something that you generally don't want from a marketing perspective, right? That's when you start getting into a very disjointed brand that can lead to it being diluted and consumer confusion. So that's what we like to avoid. So that's a common one. So inconsistent branding, because in the field, you also have people doing marketing, whether it's the store manager or the branch manager, wherever, and they have their skills vary, right? One person might know marketing, the other person might not know anything at all. So you need to kind of create tools that are accessible for everybody. You know, the other challenge,
I would think, like, Kathy, just really quick, I would even think like if you're going to give that autonomy to a location by location person, it's wildly inefficient. Even if they're all really good at marketing on one level or another, it's not a cohesive brand. And you've got one person doing a few hours of work here and there to do marketing for each location. It's just a multiplier of that. It hurts my brain. You know, as a CFO for a lot of companies, it just, I see that as being a very easy, like, we should centralize those decisions, even just from a financial perspective. But you're talking about, you know, brand integrity, and you're talking about consistency, which all add a lot of value to having somebody like you in, you know, their operations. And so, so the first, you know, kind of symptom, I suppose you see is inconsistent branding. What are some other ones?
Yeah, so that's a big one. That's usually where we start. Another one is lack of local targeting, right? So the locations are different, even in the same state. Even when I had locations here in Maine, right? A rural bank branch was going to need very different resources, very different level of support than one in downtown in a major city, right? So they're going to have different demographic needs, different preferences, different competitive landscapes as well. And so every one of those locations needs a tailored marketing approach. But it needs to be standardized because you can't just go in and create a new marketing plan for every single location when you have 150, right? So something that I've seen is a lot of inconsistency in budget, in targeting, and even just how they're delivering markets, how they're delivering their products and services to markets in some of these markets, right? You're talking about like New York City, for instance, right? You're going to use probably a 1 mile radius, if that, or a couple of block radius to target. Or you're thinking about rural Texas, where you're going to probably expand to 12, 15 miles, if not even greater, to reach your audience. So it's really important to have a kind of common baseline where you're starting, but then also be able to customize depending on the unique needs of each specific location.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point to make. When you're talking about localized marketing, there are very big differences in the distance and maybe even the population density and some of these other factors. But I would also wonder if when you're working with these companies, if they have inconsistent KPIs, one location's tracking visits and another location's tracking close rates. And you're like, well, okay, but if it's not consistent across the organization, then how do you know if any of it's working? Is that something you see as well? And we might get into that here in the episode later. I was just curious.
It is, yes. So really getting everybody on board with what are the 2 or 3 things that we're tracking. Marketers love to track kind of high level metrics like, impressions and clicks and all of that. At the end of the day, it comes down to revenue, right? So what really unifies everybody is revenue. So it's usually people coming in the door. 9 times out of 10, a lot of these locations, with a lot of these companies with physical locations, that's where people spend, right? So that's where the spending actually happens. And then it has to be tied back to some revenue goals, whether you're tracking it as a percentage of growth or which I found to be the more effective strategy than just a flat number, right? To say, hey, we need 200 new customers is not realistic. Whereas if you say, hey, we want to grow by 6% or 7% over the next 90 days, that seems to be a better benchmark that everybody can kind of work towards and achieve versus just a flat number.
So Kathy, when you're working with these companies, you gave me these 2 kind of common symptoms: inconsistent branding, lack of local targeting. Are there any more that come to mind?
Yeah, the other one is, and we'll speak more on this later too, is really building with scale in mind, right? Which is really hard to do. It's a lot harder to do than it sounds in theory, right? So when you are at the foundation and you have 3 or 4 locations, hopefully fewer than 10, and you're evaluating some of these tools, you're talking about the skill set for the team, right? What am I going to need to be able to do this? When you only have 5 or 6 locations, it's easy to do things like deploy organic social media content manually with one person doing it. When you're talking about 200 locations, not so easy. So really trying to staying away from kind of long-term infrastructure commitments, right? Like not buying systems when you're at 10 to support 10 locations, right? Really building out the infrastructure to support growth at scale so that you don't have to shift gears halfway through and migrate everything. It's a lot harder to do than building it with the end in mind.
So Kathy, when you're talking to business owners and you identify one way or the other that they might have one of these symptoms, what are some of the telltale signs? Like, how do you know? Is there a question you ask? Do you have an assessment you go through? It might just be really obvious to you, but maybe for, a lot of the folks that are going to watch this episode that aren't in the marketing world, how would they even begin to wonder if this is something that they're struggling with as well? How do you know they have these symptoms?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically I kind of call it the presenting symptom, right? It's the reason they come to me, right? It's the reason that we first start the initial conversation. And it usually has something to do with revenue, right? Revenue is either down, maybe there had a recent change in marketing leadership, right? Or the team is not performing up to their marketing goals. There's usually some sort of a reason, right? Sometimes it's something as simple as there's a new CEO who's coming on board and just wants to evaluate the current performance, right, of their marketing. Hey, how are we doing compared to our peers? How are we doing compared to what we're spending? Could be something like they have a new growth mandate. Hey, we're going into a new market, or we're going to allocate a lot more M&A resources. So there's usually one reason that brings them to me, and it's usually tied to new revenue goals or to new something is new, right? Something has changed. So that's one. And then one of the very first things I do as part of the process is I do a full marketing assessment. It's very thorough. It is something I go through and look at all of these things, right? I do an assessment of their brand, right? How is their brand reputation holding up across their different locations? What are their reviews like? Are they consistent, right? I look at some of the feedback both from their local teams and also their customers and put that together. I do an assessment of their marketing team, right? Do they have the right people and do they have the right skill sets on their team to get them to where they need to go in the future? Not just today, because they might be fine today, right? But as you're adding more locations and growing, are you going to need to add headcount or just repurpose headcount in a different capacity? I look at their vendors. It's something I always do right away. Are there someone who's hosting their websites, right? How's that performing from an SEO perspective, et cetera? So it's a pretty thorough assessment. And then at the end of it, right, I'll sit down with the CEO, whoever the leadership team is that I'm working with, and we'll go through them. And we'll go through them based on the kind of the impact to the business from my perspective, but I also get their input because if I put together a treatment plan, so to speak, right, and it doesn't necessarily align with their goals and their priorities, it's not going to be the best use of their resources, right? We always try to make sure that it is a dialogue, right, and that they are the plan we put together meets everybody's needs. Because I may see something as a marketer and say this is a huge red flag, but they have another fire that's burning over here that needs a lot more attention.
Yeah, I've often found when creating strategic plans and presenting treatment plans, I think is what you called it, which is one of my analogies that I use too. You really need it to be collaborative. Otherwise, it's going to not work. It just doesn't land the same. And it's not that it's a bad plan, but it's almost like a buy-in process. And then I think the other part of it too is, to your point, there's certain things that maybe you don't know about because it wasn't part of your assessment. I mean, how are you supposed to know what they're worried about over in some other area of the business? It's hard to ask, 10 million questions when you're doing your assessments. And so I think the collaboration for those strategic plans makes a lot of sense. Well, Kathy, this is the time of the episode that I get really pumped up about because I want to talk to you a little bit about this case study. It's a national med spa that I was working with. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because, and I'll unpack it a little bit here in a second, but I'm pretty sure that they had some of these same symptoms that you're talking about. And so I'm hoping that we can get into it. We can get your expertise on, kind of some of their issues. But just to be really clear with where, this engagement went, I was brought in to really kind of help them figure out what were some of the issues with their revenue. And this client, had about 20 locations across the country. And what they were finding is in their revenue, it wasn't as strong year-over-year growth as they were anticipating. That was kind of their symptom that they had. And so what I did when I went in there was really evaluate some of the metrics of their member management platform, because I had a sneaky suspicion that they had a little bit of churn, a little bit of attrition, I guess you could say, in their monthly recurring revenue. And surprise, surprise, the client, swore up and down that they didn't. They told me that all of their clients love them. They do these feedbacks where their clients tell them how great they are. And I'm not saying that those are not accurate, but the data showed a little bit of a different story. And so after we did a couple of focus groups, we found out that it was actually due to some of the clunkiness with the software, specifically in that membership management platform, that people were leaving that med spa. And if you've worked in the med spa space, you know that those client lifetime values are very high. You do not want to lose med spa clients. And so when we figured out that this was the issue, then my team and I got to work and actually supported them with a membership management system overhaul. It was a pretty in-depth process. They had thousands of clients, like I mentioned, across the country. And so once we got that kind of figured out, then they could go back to, acquiring new clients. But when you and I were chatting about, your expertise with multiple locations, customer facing venues, and things like that, this case study, it came to my mind right away, because I'm not a professional marketer, especially not on your level, but I'm wondering what kinds of questions you would want to ask to see if they had some of these same symptoms that you're talking about. Where would you start?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think one of uh, the first things I would do is ask what their ask about their branding, right? Ask the leadership team what they think the brand is. What do they think the brand promises? What do they think the experience should be when a person is walking into one of their med spas? And then ask the people in the field, right? The people who are actually working at the med spas, right? What do you envision it to be? And then look at some of the customer feedback and see where there are differences, right? If for instance, if the leadership team and if the local team is all saying, oh, we want them to feel, don't want them to feel rushed. We want them to feel, at ease and relaxed and like they're in good hands, right? Those are common things I've heard from med spas, right? They're not going to be intimidated, right? It's not going to feel clinical, right? But someone walks in and, they get a stack of papers to fill out right away. They go sit in a corner. Somebody comes over with white gloves and, a mask and like a full body hazmat suit. It's going to feel a little bit different, right? So making sure that that they're really on the surface, there really aren't many differences in what the leadership thinks is going on, what the local management team is doing, and then what the actual customers are saying, right? So that would sort of be the first part. The second part would be looking at how they are disseminating some of their marketing, right? What a lot of, I would say, businesses that are kind of in this middle stage of growth, right? They have more than 10-ish locations, but they don't quite have, 50, right? So they're sort of in that middle scale. They typically have a person or two that's actually creating some of these assets to send to the field for every single promotion, for every single instance. And that is incredibly ineffective, right? Time-wise, cost-wise. And so I would look at just their, how are they communicating with the field and how are they sharing some of these marketing tools that they are then using in the field. So that is always one of the first places I go to just to see how the brand delivery is performing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the first point, I was just kind of thinking about it. You really kind of get a baseline from, in my world, they call it a top-down analysis. That's where you start with the leadership on top, right? And you get their opinion. And then you'd also do a bottom-up analysis. And so you'd kind of go to the line-level employees and see what they have to say. And, gosh darn it, there's a difference there. And so when that happens, then it's more obvious, where maybe some of the pain points are because the execution isn't quite happening how maybe the senior leaders had a vision for their strategy to go. So that's really interesting. Okay. And then the second point you made was about how they're disseminating their marketing. Maybe they've got different pamphlets or outdated pamphlets or, maybe it's different local ads, but they're just not effective. And that's really interesting. Yeah, I think when I'm thinking about this particular client, again, I didn't get into all of those specifics with them, but I would bet that there's a huge disconnect often between what senior leadership thinks that the strategies are and then maybe the execution of the line level. Does that happen often in your world?
It does. It does. It happens a lot. And it really takes regular communication between corporate marketing and the field to sort of iron out those kinks, right? It's, in my experience, those local marketing initiatives are fantastic when they're done in partnership with corporate marketing. So for instance, if we're promoting Botox this month because it's, it's summer, right? It's, it just makes sense to put a focus on that. And we're spending a lot of resources doing Botox, but the field is promoting something completely different, right? That doesn't necessarily complement Botox, right? Maybe it's, laser facelifts or something else, right? That's just completely out of the ballpark. It's going to be really hard to kind of get people in with one service and then cross-sell them the other, right? So it really needs to be kind of a cohesive strategy to work off, so one could work off the other. When it's successful, everyone's working together and in unison, and there's dialogue around, hey, here are the 3 or 4 corporate initiatives we're promoting for this month, for this quarter, and here are the suggested services that you can overlay with that at the local level to cross-sell, to better engage, to try to retain the clients. And ultimately to serve their needs better, right? Here are some complementary services or some complementary products that we can offer. And it's not just something that you do once, right? Unfortunately, I wish it was, right? You build it and then you hand it off and it's done. In my experience, the brands that have been really successful with really kind of bridging that gap, right? That delicate balance between corporate control and local autonomy, they continue that partnership. And so I'm used to having monthly meetings with the field where we share upcoming promotions. Here's what's going on. Here's what's coming down the pike. Hey, do you have any questions? Here's when you'll get the assets. Here's how we want you to put them up, even. You'd be surprised. Signage in lobbies and at the reception desk ends up being a really, really big discussion at those conversations, because the local teams love, they're like, oh, we'll just print our own flyer. Well, that's a big no-no, because what's it going to look like? Where is it going to go? Right. How is it going to complement everything else that's currently out there, from that brand experience, from that customer experience? So really, it has to be that continuous dialogue, and really a partnership of, here's how we're supporting you, here's how you're supporting the work that we're doing.
So Kathy, I wanted to just kind of summarize kind of where we're at, because I want to transition to our second episode in just a second. But when we're talking about multiple locations and marketing for them, obviously you're the expert. You've been here, you've done this, you've seen these symptoms and these trends in the industry. And so you've got some really good questions that you ask. We kind of talked about this particular case study, this national med spa client of mine, and some questions that you'd ask to kind of ascertain a little bit more about some of the gaps that are maybe in their marketing, and really kind of getting into the heart of probably some of the same issues that you see, whether it's inconsistent branding, lack of local marketing, or building without having a true scaling foundation. I would guess that this company, this national med spa company, has all of these issues, if I'm being honest. But what I want to do just here really quick is summarize, tell our audience the cautionary tales that you and I are going to be getting into in episode 2. Because a lot of times when I'm with my guests, this is the fun episode. Unfortunately, when we're in business, not everybody listens to everything we say. It's just how it works sometimes. And then it's almost like, well, what happens? We gave them this advice, and where did they go, and how does it all work? And so you've got a couple of cautionary tales. I've got one as well. I think that you mentioned that yours kind of are centered around this idea of beginning with the end in mind. And really, there's kind of two different perspectives there. You talked about having, on one hand, kind of the tools to help you build for tomorrow. And then on the other hand, it's the due diligence and really kind of the clarification on M&A deals to make sure they're the right fit. And so those are going to be really interesting stories to hear. I'd love to tell one as well. I worked with a client in the finance space, trying to help them go from a local regional presence to more of a national presence. And so they needed a national acquisition strategy. But the big story here is that they weren't really careful with their delineation of their branding costs. And so I'd love to share with the audience a little bit about that in episode 2. And so that being said, I hope that everybody stays tuned for episode 2 with Kathy Guillory. Thanks.